Thanks a lot for the introduction. It's great to be here today, and I apologize I haven't been able to be here for the last couple days. Followed a little bit on Twitter. It looks like you've had some good talks, and hopefully what I talk about isn't too much of a repeat of anything you've heard. I know Lori Sprague talked about Mississippi River Basin issues, and so I'm going to talk about some of our Iowa nitrogen issues and some of what's going on to try to reduce nitrogen loading leaving the state of Iowa. The situation that we have in Iowa, and this is probably repeat for most of you, but we have high nitrogen concentrations in many of our Iowa streams, greater than 10 milligrams per liter of the drinking water standard in some streams, and so that causes challenges. Certainly it has caused challenges for the city of Des Moines for their drinking water. And so most of you probably know a number of years ago they filed a lawsuit against 10 drainage districts in 3 counties in Iowa over the nitrate that was being exported from those drainage systems. It's also a concern, drinking water, for some of the small municipalities where their source water is getting close, in some cases, to that 10 milligrams per liter. It would be a expensive situation for them if they needed to implement nitrate removal. Iowa is a big contributor to nitrogen to the Gulf of Mexico. So agriculture is important to the state of Iowa. We're a leader in corn production, soybean production, pork production, eggs. Unfortunately, we are a large contributor of nitrogen to the Gulf as well. A recent paper documented that Iowa's contribution of nitrogen to the Gulf is 29%. And a range of 11 to 52%. So if we think about the land area of Iowa compared to the Mississippi River Basin, a disproportionate amount of nitrogen gets to the Gulf or gets to the Mississippi River from Iowa. Efforts in Iowa are really kind of started getting more urgency with the hypoxia action plan in 2008 that called for states to develop comprehensive nitrogen and phosphorus reduction strategies. So in 2013, Iowa released their Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. The long-term goal of that is to reduce nitrate export or nitrogen export. Most of the nitrogen in our streams is in the nitrate form. Reduce that by 45%, with 41% of that needing to come from agricultural sources. So it's estimated about 92% of the nitrogen that we see in the streams in Iowa is coming from our non-point sources, primarily agricultural sources. So this one we can move on. So as we think about where this loading is coming from, this is a map that Mark David put together that was in the Journal of Environmental Quality that just illustrates where in the Corn Belt the nitrogen losses are estimated to be the greatest. And you can see that dark blue area in Iowa there. That's the Des Moines Lobe, the most recent glaciated area. There's 2 things that we have a lot of in those parts of Iowa, or in that part of Iowa. One, I'll show you in a second, we have a lot of corn and soybean production. The other is we have this underground network of drainage, artificial subsurface drainage, that allows us to have the crop production that we do. And so, we're in Nebraska now. The amount of subsurface drainage is much less here, but we get into Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Much of that area where the nitrate is being lost from, that nitrate is exported to the stream through a subsurface drainage network. It's pretty interesting, kind of the whole history. Some of these states, and certainly that part of Iowa, is probably one of the most altered hydrologic areas in the world because historically, the stream networks didn't extend a long ways up into our watershed, so there's been both a significant alteration in our surface drainage network with drainage ditches, and then this subsurface drainage network as well. So why do we have these high nitrate problems? One of the common aspects that's talked about is this is just primarily an over-fertilization problem. That farmers are just putting on too much nitrogen, and that's the primary reason we have high nitrate. And certainly, as I'll talk about, we need to do a better job with nitrogen management. But that is probably not, I think the science, as we look at the science assessments across this rain-fed corn belt area with subsurface drainage networks, that's not the primary reason we have the high nitrate. So if we look at here, this is from our Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. We estimated nitrogen application rate, including animal manure and fertilizer. And if you just look at the bottom there on the Iowa total, we estimated the nitrogen application rate to corn and a corn-soybean rotation, and then to corn and a continuous corn system. We estimated about, from fertilizer sales data and animal units, about 151 to corn following beans and 200 to corn following corn. The recommended rate, at least from Iowa State University and the maximum return to nitrogen estimate, is 133 for corn following beans and 190 for corn following corn. So yes, we're a little above that, but if we look at that profitable range from 121 to 146 for corn following beans, we're just kind of at that upper end of that range, but not a gross over-fertilization problem. We can make some gains there. Certainly in certain land areas of Iowa, if we look at the first one, MLRA, Major Land Resource Area 1026, we're at 180 and 230. So that one we could make, there's maybe more room for gains with nitrogen management. The biggest problem we have, if we think about nitrate loss, is we have an annual cropping system. So this just shows crop rotations by major land resource area from 06 to 2012, or 2010, excuse me. And the yellow is corn and soybean rotation. The orange is continuous corn. And as we look at this in most areas of Iowa, we have 80–90% in a corn, soybean, or continuous corn rotation. So we have an annual cropping system. And if we think about historically, that was a prairie, wetland type of landscape where now we have annual crop production. I like to show this graph, or talk about this graph, just because as we think about the land use change that's happened in Iowa, sometimes we hear we've seen an exponential growth in the number of corn acres in the state of Iowa. But actually, if you look at that red line, this is stretching from 1926 to 2018, you'll see, since the 20s, we've had over 10 million acres of corn in the state of Iowa planted. So we've not seen a dramatic growth in corn acres over that almost 100-year period. However, if you look at the blue dots there, that's our soybean acres. And so we've grown from next to nothing in the 20s and up until after World War II to about 10 million acres present day. So about 14, in some years, 14 million acres of corn, 10 million acres of soybeans. Those soybeans have displaced things like small grains, pasture, hay ground. So we've taken what was a more diverse cropping rotation, made it almost completely an annual cropping system with corn and soybeans. And so, as a result, this is a slide from a colleague in the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State, Mike Castellano, that I think illustrates why we have this problem. We have some of the best soils in the world in Iowa, mollisol soils that are very rich in native soil organic matter. And so, even without fertilizer inputs, that red line illustrates the rate of soil nitrate production from native soil organic matter. So in the spring of the year, when soils start to warm and get moist, we convert a portion of that organic nitrogen into the nitrate pool. And then the green line there is the rate of corn or soybean nitrate uptake. And so if you look at the red line versus the green line, I think we see why we have the problems that we do in Iowa. And it wouldn't be a problem except that in April, May, and June in Iowa, we get a lot of excess precipitation that moves water through the soil profile. And so we leach that nitrate out of the system. And so that gray area is illustrating kind of when we have susceptible periods for nitrate loss in our corn, soybean cropping system, even without fertilizer inputs. And fertilizer inputs would just kind of add to this. And so if we think back to what the cropping systems, what the historic land use was with prairie, if we think about the more diverse crop rotations that maybe we had in the 40s and 50s, we would have had some plants growing out there in that April, May, and June period. So we might lose, in some areas, 70% of our nitrate loss in the combined months of April, May, and June. And certainly in April and May, there's not much plant uptake from our annual cropping systems. But if we had a little bit more diverse cropping rotation, we could get that green line started a little earlier in the year, so the gray area is reduced. So as part of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, we recognize this is a huge problem. This nitrate loss is a huge problem. We needed to look at what agricultural practices could we use in Iowa that would have the potential to reduce that nitrate that's lost from the plant root zone and then exported to the stream. So we reviewed available literature on water quality data from field studies that documented water quality performance. And we reviewed data from Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin to try to have similar soils, similar climatic conditions. And this is a summary of the estimated nitrate reduction with a variety of practices. The ones at the top, kind of in the ugly yellow color there, or the mustard yellow, I shouldn't call it ugly, but the mustard yellow color are kind of our in-field nitrogen management practices. And what you see there is that, yes, some of those can reduce nitrate loss, but as we think about a 40% reduction, moving from fall to spring application, side dressing nitrogen, using a nitrification inhibitor, we're about in that 5 to 10% reduction in nitrate loss. Okay, with a pretty big standard deviation. The error bars there are the standard deviation that illustrate, kind of year-to-year variability because of weather that we might see in the performance. So we can make gains there, but it's not going to get us to our 40% reduction. As we start moving down, we have things like cover crops that we estimated about a 30% reduction in nitrate loss with the cover crops. We get into our more extended rotations there in the light green, about a 40% reduction. And then if we went to a more perennial-based system with perennial energy crops, pasture, CRP, we might be getting 80 or 90% reduction in nitrate loss. And then, so all those practices kind of above that black line are all practices that may be done in field to reduce that nitrate that's moving below the plant root zone. The ones in blue there are things that we can do that are a little bit unique to the tile drain landscape, because these are practices that we may be able to intercept that tile line, remove the nitrate before it gets to the stream. So things like controlled drainage or shallow drainage, wetlands, bioreactors, and saturated buffers. And I'll talk a little bit about those since you might not be as familiar. So try not to have too many more graphs here, but one more. Well, there's a couple more. But I'm an engineer, I gotta have some graphs, sorry. But this slide just illustrates the response of the nitrate concentration that we see leaving the plant root zone as a function of nitrogen application rate to corn. And so the nitrate concentration is from the combined corn-soybean system. I think this is important, 2 points. One is, if you think back to what I said the average application rate was in Iowa, our estimated average, at least on a statewide basis. There are some that are higher than this and some lower, but on average 150. If we move from 150 to the recommended rate of 135, we'd only estimate about a 9% reduction in nitrate loss. Okay, so it's important, it helps us get to this 45% reduction goal, but it's not going to get all the way there. If we were just going to use nitrogen management, when I talk to farmers, I say, you might not believe anything else I say, but will you at least grant me the most aggressive form of nitrogen management is no nitrogen application? Okay, and they usually say yes. Okay, so if we went from 150 to 0, we get about a 45% reduction in nitrate loss. So if we wanted to just solve it with in-field nitrogen management in Iowa, we'd almost have to go to no nitrogen application. And that would not be something we'd want to do for economics for the farmers, but also, we're still trying to grow a crop with no nitrogen inputs. We're taking nitrogen out of that system, and over time, that may degrade our soil of organic matter, which could lead to greater environmental problems in the future. So I think this just illustrates why we need some of the other practices that we'll talk about. And one of the in-field practices, at least within our corn soybean cropping system that is getting more attention, is the use of a cover crop that we're trying to seed into either interseeding into standing crop or drilling in after harvest. This is certainly a fall where drilling in after harvest is a challenge because we're in the harvest period and we wouldn't get much growth. But what we're trying to do with that cover crop is, if you look at the gray area, we're trying to reduce that gray area with that active cover crop growth and uptake of nitrate in the above ground biomass and the root system, and reduce the risk of nitrate loss. And in fact, we have documented that we can see decreased nitrate loss with the use of a cover crop. This is data from a winter cereal rye cover crop planted in north central Iowa, so about 60 miles north of I-80. So this would be in an area of Iowa where it's a little more challenged to get good growth of cover crops. So I like to say this is kind of on the conservative side of what we might expect for nitrate reduction with cover crops, and we still saw about a 35% reduction with that winter cereal rye cover crop. Okay, some of these edge of field practices that we're looking at, and it's nice to see Jim here, because a lot of these practices we're looking at as part of our Transforming Drainage project, which is a NIFA-funded project with collaborators kind of all across the Corn Belt, looking at drainage practices. And so one of the practices we're looking at is drainage water management or controlled drainage, where you see that underground network of pipes there. We're putting these control structures, those boxes in there, to try to hold water back during certain times of the year to reduce the nitrate that's exported out of that drainage system. And we can see maybe a 30 to 70% reduction in how much nitrate is coming out the tile when we use that controlled drainage system. Now, we'd like to say that we could improve crop production with this, but we've not seen much of that, because at least in this system, we're not putting water back in. We're just relying on the rainfall to kind of replenish the soil reservoir. One of the challenges with this controlled drainage system is we need a pretty flat field, and Iowa is pretty flat, but not uniformly flat. You kind of need a uniform slope of about 0.5% or 1%. Unfortunately, Iowa is not uniformly flat, like, say, the Platte River Valley, where this type, if our system was that flat, it would work quite well. Another one is a subsurface drainage bioreactor. Right now, that's kind of a fancy name for a wood chip trench, because we're using a carbon media, routing a portion of the drainage water through this trench filled with wood chips, and we're promoting denitrification. And so we're using the carbon from the wood chips to help us with the denitrification process. And so we might be able to route, on average, 60 to 80% of the annual tile flow through one of these reactors. And if we look at the mass load reduction that would have come from the field, we might be able to get a 40% or 50% nitrate export reduction through the use of this wood chip trench. But this is a pretty big, well, it's not as big as another practice I'll talk about, but it's still 20 foot wide, 100 foot long, about 3 foot deep, full of wood chips. So in a state like Iowa that doesn't have a lot of trees, as I'll talk about in a minute, scaling up, we would need an awful lot of trees to make these work on a large scale. But certainly they are going in some areas. Another one, saturated buffers. And so this is, again, a practice we're looking at as part of Transforming Drainage. But a colleague, Tom Eisenhardt at Iowa State, and Dan Janes at the USDA ARS, one night we're talking about, we have all these buffers in Iowa. And right now that drainage network goes right under that buffer and exports the nitrate to the stream. So we're not getting any nitrate, or we're getting very little nitrate reduction benefits from that buffer that we've planted out there. Yes, we'll get surface runoff benefits, but nitrate reduction, very little. So what if we put a control structure at the upstream edge of that buffer, run a tile line out along that upstream edge, and try to promote shallow groundwater flow below the buffer? And what they found with this system is, again, if we look at the overall nitrate reduction that we've kept from getting to the stream, we can see a 40 to 50% nitrate reduction in this process, and primarily nitrate removal through denitrification and plant uptake. And the performance will depend on some of the soils and how long we can put that lateral along the upstream edge of that buffer. But siting will be important for this practice because if we have a sand lens where we don't get retention time below that buffer, we're not going to get the denitrification that we need. Also, we would not want to put this in a location where we have a steep bank that maybe we create a seepage face along the stream that created any stream bank stability problems. So actually there's a saturated buffer viewer where the USDA ARS, Mark Helmers group that has worked with the Ag Conservation Planning Framework, they've set out a map where you can see sites in Iowa or streams in Iowa where this might work. The last practice, no, one more after this, okay, but we do have these opportunity for targeted wetland restoration where we can put a wetland in at a location where we can capture all the surface and subsurface flow and get denitrification in there. And so these wetlands is trying to illustrate a watershed with that targeted wetland restoration at the bottom. One of these might look kind of like this when it's done, so I think we could see it provides other services beyond denitrification. And what Dr. Bill Crumpton, this is his work that he's been working on for over 20 years, but what he's found is that the wetlands that occupy about 1% of the landscape area that they're collecting water from, so the wetland pool is about 1% of the land area, can remove on average about 52% of the nitrate coming from that upstream area. Okay, so that sounds pretty good, unless you maybe own that land and needed to put it in, but I think for all the other services it provides, it can be very effective. The one practice that we're starting to look at as part of the Transforming Drainage Project and some other efforts is drainage water recycling. So we have this drainage water, as I said, April, May, and June, we get a lot of the water that goes out. What if we captured that and used that for supplemental irrigation for the crops? Okay, we're reducing downstream water flow, reducing downstream nutrient export, hopefully increasing crop production. But our questions are, or a big question is, what is the crop production benefit on good soils throughout the Midwest? And we don't know that. We're in a rain-fed area. Many years we get plenty of rainfall. And so what kind of crop production benefits might we get from this practice? So this is in the early stages of starting to look at this, and we're getting some sites throughout the state. I'm going to skip the other slide and get to the main point is I think I have about 2 minutes left. So within Iowa, we tried to estimate what it would take to reach our goal of a 41 to 42% overall load reduction. And unless we do huge-scale land retirement, what we found is we really need all of the available practices. We need to do a good job with nitrogen management, and we need cover crops, and we need some of these edge-of-field practices. So this one top scenario there is we're doing the best job with nitrogen management. 60% of all our acres in Iowa have a cover crop on them, and 27% of our ag land is treated with a wetland, and 60% of our drained land has a bioreactor. Okay? And as one of my bosses, John Lawrence, reminds everybody, those are ands and not ors. So as we look at this, in millions of acres treated, we need about 17 or 18 million acres treated with better nitrogen management. We need about 12 million acres of cover crops. We need about 7.5 million acres treated by wetlands, not 7.5 million of the acres of wetlands, but treated by wetlands, and about 6 million acres treated by bioreactors. That relates to about 7,500 of those wetlands that I showed you, and about 120,000 of those bioreactors that I showed you. In the short term, even if financial resources were not an impediment, I don't think we have enough wood chips in the state of Iowa to put in 120,000 bioreactors next year. Okay, so this is going to take some time to scale up. Also, if we think about 7,500 wetlands, I put it this way. We need to finish one of those style of wetlands every working day for the next 30 years. That's the scale of change that we're talking about. So as we think about this, this is a generational type change to get there. And if we want to get there, we're going to need to do it all, from in-field nitrogen management to thinking of our cropping practices. I think we need to think about, are there other more diversified crop rotations that maybe we can use, more pasture-based systems in certain areas of the state, more forage needs. And then we're still going to probably need some of these edge-of-field practices, like bioreactors, saturated buffers, wetlands, and maybe drainage water recycling. Okay, so my summary is that I think we can reach these goals. It's going to take a huge amount of implementation. But as we think about it, are there opportunities to implement these? Some of these practices may enhance or protect the long-term value of the land. Things like cover crops, maybe more diverse crop rotations, may help us with things like soil erosion, soil health. And then nobody has ever accused me of being an optimist. In fact, most people call me an extreme pessimist. But I think there may be rural economic benefits. Because if we have to put 7,500 wetlands, for example, in the state of Iowa, there's a lot of human resources, human capital, or human investment in humans to put those things on the land. I think there are small business opportunities to work with siting those, designing those, managing those types of systems. Same with bioreactors. We have land improvement contractors in the state of Iowa. I think they could spend years and years putting in bioreactors and maybe do it at a time of the year when they're not doing some of their other work. And so even if we think about 12 million acres of cover crops, the individual landowners or farmers may not be able to plant those cover crops within the labor pool they have, and so they may have to contract that with others to put those cover crops on, and there may be small business opportunities for them. So I think we can look at this two ways. The mountain is very high, but there are a lot of opportunities, I think, within our rural communities to help with this if we try to move forward with it. I guess my last point with that is I think that the dialogue in Iowa has shifted a little bit from this just being a fertilizer management problem to we need resources to try to get these practices in place. And there's a lot of debate on how we get those resources. You can read the papers from Iowa, and there's a lot of debate on how we should do it, but at least that debate is going on with a recognition of how much change we need and the financial resources that are needed, but sometimes we don't talk about the people resources that would be needed to help the farmers with all these practices. And I think that's really critical. And one of the things that I think is important that we need to articulate to legislators and others about the human resources that are needed to help farmers with these practices into the future. So thank you very much. And if we have time.